Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Even on a budget, quality is non-negotiable. That's why Quince is the place to score high-end essentials at 50 to 80% less than similar brands. Get your hands on buttery soft cashmere sweaters from just $60, Italian leather jackets, and so much more. And the best part about Quince, they exclusively partner with factories committed to safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Elevate your style without the elevated price tag with Quince. Go to quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, Randy.
Since we founded Bombas, we've always said our socks, underwear, and T-shirts are super soft. Any new ideas?
Maybe sublimely soft.
Or disgustingly cozy.
Wait, what?
I got it. Bombas. Absurdly comfortable essentials for yourself
and for those facing homelessness.
Because one purchased equals one donated.
Wow, did we just write an ad?
Yes.
Bombas. Big comfort for everyone. Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase.
Hello, folks. Apologies for the slightly nasal interlude because I am rather full of flu, as you can tell from the incoherence of this comment. Just a quick reminder, the lovely folks at Hellion have given us a discount code that you can enjoy on Glory is Fleeting, the book from which the chapter that Gary is talking about in this podcast is based. If you head to hellion.co.uk, select Glory is Fleeting, add it to your basket, and then add Glory 23, that is Glory GLORY 23 at checkout, you will be able to enjoy 20% off when you buy Glory is Fleeting. Enjoy.
Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where today we're going to attempt to do things ever so slightly differently. It's still a podcast and it's still a cracking topic. And what's not different is the focus on many other perspectives on topics that you might think you know very well. So we're going to look at Salamanca, but crucially we're going to look at it from the French perspective. I am joined by Gary Wills, who is incredibly modest. I'm going to open by saying that. I mean, he doesn't describe himself as a historian, but has written several books, including Wellington's First Battle, which is on Boxtel in 1794, The Men Behind the Memorial, which is a World War I book. It's the wrong war. We don't need to worry ourselves with that. But, you know, if you've got a World War I interest, go and have a read. Wellington at Bay, Villa Muriel, 1812. And his latest book, Throwing Thunderbolts, War of the First Coalition, 1792-7, which has been the focus of a kind of protracted Twitter kind of stream thread thing, technical term there, where every day Gary has been posting about different battles that take place. And it's fantastic. If you like this kind of on this day in history stuff, you're going to love it. So people, go follow Gary on Twitter. Details are going to be in the descriptor to this episode, but you'll also find him by just searching K-Shot Publishing, which is the account that he posts under. He's also, though, written a few chapters and done a whole kind of bunch of research on battles like Boxtel, Lincel, and Toulon. But quite recently, he did something on McCune at the Battle of Salamanca. So he and I put our heads together and decided that it would be nice, having done Salamanca quite to death on this show from the British perspective, to do Salamanca from the French perspective, which is how we're going to do it today. Now, what's different about that? Well, Gary has a series of maps to help us through this. So feel free to continue listening on YouTube. But if you want the images that are going to kind of be key to the discussions that we're going to have over the course of the next however long, you need to head over to YouTube, search for the Napoleonic Wars channel, and you will then be able to see the video version of this show. So that is a shameless plug of sorts, but it's one that allows you to get the full experience of this episode. And whilst you're there, why not whack the like button and subscribe? That was a shameless plug. Gary, sorry about the overly long introduction there. Great to see you. Welcome. This is your first time on the show, I believe. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. It's my first time, and it's a great honour to get the chance to talk about this work, which came out of my annual Twitter rant about the 40,000 men in 40 minutes statement.
Yes, that very infamous quote that tell you what, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. That deserves like a whole sort of question in its own right. Let's start, because a lot of what you've done on this is about McCune, right?
Yeah.
Inevitably, we talk a lot about Marmont for very obvious reasons. Ferry gets kind of a passing mention because he gets a horrible death, gets cut in half by a cannonball. We'll also talk about Ferry's last stand, as it were. I know you've got some really interesting comments on that. But McCune, one of the divisional commanders at Salamanca, where does he come from, and what had he done sort of pre-Salamanca?
Well, pre the revolution, he joined the Pioneer Corps, and he worked his way up to lieutenant. But when the revolution came, typical of the man, I think, he enlisted as a grenadier in the first Paris Volunteers. And within a couple of years, he was a lieutenant in the 23rd Infantry Regiment. And he progressed through the ranks. And so by the time of the Napoleon's campaigns in 1805 to 1807, he's in Ney's Corps. And he was a general brigade and fought at Friedland and also at Elchingen, Jena, and Eylau. So he had a lot of experience. When Ney went to Spain, McCune went with him, again as a brigade commander, and he got his promotion to general division in Spain when he was given the 5th division of the Army of Portugal. I rather like him, although I don't know him. And there's a couple of things I like about him. One of his colonels described him as the sort of man who likes to get up close to the enemy and not watch them from afar, because being from afar multiplies the images you see. So he described him as standing, so this is a general division and also a corps commander, standing between his tirailleurs and his waiting columns to see what was going on. So this is the sort of guy. The other thing I like about him is that there are that I could find, no portraits of him. And if anybody listening to this knows of a portrait of him, I'd be delighted to hear about it. But there aren't any portraits of him that I can find. And this is probably because he's the sort of guy who would rather go to the Palais Royal and get thrown out of it while gambling than sit in an artist studio having his portrait painted. So he's that sort of guy. He believed in a very aggressive style of warfare, which clearly got him into trouble on more than one occasion. And as I hope I will show, Salamanca is not one of those occasions.
Yeah, I often feel McCune sort of almost ends up being a footnote in the Salamanca story, but we'll not now. That's like the reason behind the chapter, right? But we just sort of go Thermia and McCune, some things happen, and then we move on. And I think it's actually Thomier, isn't it? Apologies to French listeners for the pronunciation there, but I think there's a lot of focus on Thomier, perhaps for obvious reasons, and McCune just sort of gets pushed to one side. Yeah, I've found the same issue trying to find a portrait of the guy, not easy. No. Which is funny for somebody sort of that senior, but perhaps it's a reflection of the fact that he's out in Spain, and as you say, he's got better things to do with his time, perhaps, than sit and pose for a portrait. In terms of his personal character, what's he like to actually get on with? Does he end up rubbing people up the wrong way, like so many generals during this period, or is he?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things is his chief of staff wasn't a big fan of his, and felt he treated his subordinates very brusquely, and so yeah, he wasn't popular in that regard, and obviously Marmont didn't like him at all, as we shall see.
Do you want to talk about that now, or do you want to save that a little bit? Just kind of that friction between the two.
Yeah, I think we should probably talk a bit more about how he fits into the Salamanca story,
Okay.
and so that we know what my baseline was in doing this work, and everybody will have read Oman and Fortescue's accounts of Salamanca, and in those accounts, it's a very simple story. The Wellington, in a moment of brilliance, sees Thomier's division parading down the Monte d'Azan, decides there's a big enough gap for him to do something, and attacks that division. And then each of the French left-wing divisions are apparently destroyed in turn. The 6th Division, led by Tolpin, and obviously Macoun's division, the 5th Division. And so all of these divisions are destroyed. And if you read these accounts, they're said to be streaming towards Albert de Tormes, never to be seen again. And so Fortescue, for example, describes them as being destroyed for all military purposes, and that is the story that gets repeated time and time again, and it culminates in, as we said at the beginning, Napier citing the unknown French officer who described it as the defeat of 40,000 men in 40 minutes. And I think when you take it simply like that, it's sort of the Ladybird book, it's a fairly simple story. And as you mentioned earlier on, Ferré got the dubious honour of defending the rear guard, but he did it alone, because one of his guys said he did it alone. So that's the story, the base story that we start from. I think it's a very convincing story. On the screen at the moment is my favourite picture of Salamanca, which I like to think shows Lieutenant Balthazar of the 66th Line bravely defending his eagle against the British cavalry, which we will come into more. Before I go on to say what I think actually happened, it's probably worth saying what Professor Rory Muir said about McCune in his conclusions. He said, McCune's movements are impossible to reconstruct precisely. And I wanted to make that point because what I'm going to present during this discussion is a whole bunch of weak signals. Because if there were strong signals, Professor Muir would have seen them, and we wouldn't necessarily need to have this discussion. But if you look at it from the French perspective, there are a whole series of things that don't add up, and perhaps I should go on to talk about those as they occur to me.
I'm glad that you did bring in Rory on this. Somebody who folks will know I have a great deal of respect for and a lot of love for his work. His book, Salamanca 1812, is, in my opinion, superb. And I particularly love the fact that he is very frank about the challenges of this. And he not only kind of gives you that standard commentary on the battle, but then also kind of lays all of these sources alongside one another and goes, this is what they say, but they contradict one another, and it's a mess. And in terms of understanding just how irritating actually history can be sometimes in trying to unpick all of these kind of little knots and trying to work out what is the reality. It's a really good indication of actually what goes on behind the scenes in the mind of a historian. So I thoroughly recommend that to people, in addition, of course, to Glory is Fleeting, where you will find the chapter which covers what we're talking about today. Straight away, though, I want to talk about something that's a bit odd in terms of the accepted version. And you alluded to it there, you know, that perception that you've got these two French divisions just sort of casually going for a stroll along the Monte de Zan. Go and stand on the Monte de Zan and then try to imagine an entire division marching along its top. You wouldn't do it. And there's a really good reason why you wouldn't do it. When you get to the end of the Monte de Zan, it's a really steep climb down. So the point has been made to me by a fan of the show, which in turn comes from Rob Pocock, the Battlefield Guide, that actually there's a possibility they were on both sides of the Monte de Zan, you know, kind of split with the Monte de Zan between them. I'm curious if you've kind of got any thoughts on that and whether you found any evidence that might lead us to some conclusions one way or the other on that problem.
Well, I think one of the interesting things is that in Marmont's memoirs, he talked about McCune actually advocating to him that they attack Wellington, and Marmont dismissed him out of hand. And the other thing you have to ask yourself about the Monte de Zan, from where Marmont stood, he had two basic options that day. He could try and mount a serious attack on Wellington, and he could have sent his divisions around Wellington's flank, intending to seriously compromise Wellington. If he was going to do that, he wouldn't have sent Thomier's along the top of the Monte de Zan where Wellington could see them. So it's fairly clear, I think, from what he asked Thomier's to do, that all he was expecting was that as soon as he sent his divisions along that hilltop, Wellington would see them and say, right, it's time to leave. And, so, that turned out to be a massive miscalculation in the context of how Thomier's executed it. And, but yes, the whole geography, seems to have swallowed up Curto's light cavalry brigade as well in the whole thing of it. So, God knows what he thought he was doing.
It is a mystery that we can only scratch our heads at for the moment, sadly. Okay, so let's talk about how you began to notice problems with this version. Talk us through sort of you've alluded to this or a little bit already, but I just want to sort of unpick this a little bit further. How did you start to sort of become aware of issues with it? Was it just the simplicity of it? So Thomier's men get broken, McCune's men get broken, and then they all just run away, which doesn't sound really like the French army that we know of other campaigns. This is a force that consists of incredibly brave men who fight very well. In some cases, have multiple battles and campaigns to their name, and the idea that they're just going to break and run like raw conscripts perhaps doesn't sort of sit well with what you'd expect.
Well, I came at it from a slightly different point of view. After I published Wellington's first battle, I was demonstrated my war game of Boxtel to Carol Duval, and as she left, she said to me, "Oh, you should look at Villemuriel." And I initially thought, well, that would be a nice article in the War Games magazine. Well, 8 years later, Wellington at Bay was born, and but as I said, I am the reason I do this history is for a very trivial reason. I'm a war gamer. I like to recreate these things with toy soldiers, and so when looking at Villamuriel, coincidentally, it involved McCune's division and Leith's division, although Leith wasn't with them anymore. And so what I needed to know what to paint up to put on the table, is McCune's eagles. I needed to know what his battalions carried. And so I started to look at Salamanca because it's the obvious place to start. It's for all of this sort of thing. And I read in Oman that Oman makes the point that because two of McCune's regiments, their senior battalions were 4th battalions, he makes the point that they couldn't have carried eagles because following losses of eagles earlier in the empire, Napoleon took them away from all but the 1st battalion. And so Oman concluded that obviously McCune would only have had 2 eagles at Salamanca. Well, he was wrong because he overlooked the fact that, like all armies, the French army has a rule, but actually to understand it, you have to know what the exceptions are. And in the case of McCune's division, the two of his regiments, the 2 that were led by their 4th battalions, the 66th and the 82nd, were originally garrisoned in the West Indies, the 66th in Guadeloupe and the 82nd on Martinique. And obviously, I think around 1809, the British took those islands off the French, and those 3 battalions of each regiment with their eagles were captured and prisoners of war and so on. What the French did is they recreated the regiments, but numbered them 4, 5, 6. In fact, one of them was 7th Battalion in both cases, and they gave the 4th battalions an eagle. So this meant that McCune had 4 eagles at Salamanca, yet apparently destroyed by Leith from the front and the heavy cavalry from the flank. He got away with all 4 of those eagles. So how did that happen? I asked myself. And of course, Leith did capture an eagle, but it wasn't one of McCune's. It was one of the 7th divisions. And so this immediately begged an obvious question. The second bit I needed to know was, what guns did McCune have? What was his divisional artillery like? So again, go back to Salamanca. Let's have a look at what was going on. At Salamanca, the returns for the French army show that while all of the divisions of the left wing lost artillery, lost some of their divisional guns, McCune never lost any. He retained all of his guns. So he escaped from this disaster with all of his eagles and all of his guns. And it begs the question of, well, how did that happen? How did that happen? And the other thing that seemed odd to me was when you look at Oman's map of the battle, you can see McCune here to the southwest of the village, and yet Albert de Tormes is to the southeast. So what Oman is having us believe is that Leith attacked up the Montezan, hit and destroyed McCune, and instead of them running away south, they ran away southeast. And that didn't ring true to me because they would have missed Ferry's position and all of this. So that raised a significant doubt in my mind.
So, folks, sorry, if you could just go back to the previous one. This is the classic map from So Charles Oman's history of the Peninsular War, it's probably been the basis of many a reproduction, frankly, over time. And you can see top left, Ardea Tejada, that's where Pakenham's division start out, and then they end up striking sort of Thomier full in the face. For more details on this, that I did a live stream on Salamanca. You can go back and watch that. But this is the classic thing. And there is a marked gap between Thomier and McCune's division, which has often sort of left me with a little bit of a head scratch in itself, because McCune doesn't feel particularly isolated. When you're stood there, and this is always the value of walking the ground, when you're stood there, you look at where McCune is in relation to where the rest of the army is, and he doesn't feel anywhere near as isolated as Thomier would have been. Is that something that strikes you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the distance that between Thomier's and McCune is huge, and clearly the big problem here is that Thomier was allowed to go that far ahead, because had he kept closer to McCune, and in fact McCune definitely, I'm pretty sure McCune wasn't there, but if it had kept closer to the rest of the French divisions and followed their normal deployment, which again I'm going to come on to later, Wellington wouldn't have had an opportunity to exploit. And where he was when Wellington decided he needed to attack is another matter. I mean, I not studied Thomier's at all, so I can't comment on why he's shown there. But it's certainly worth understanding a bit more detail. But yes, the whole point about the Leith's axis of attack is, I think, one of the key elements of this that's made me wonder, well, has this been misunderstood?
And in terms of that gap, there's often a lot of debate about who's at fault. Should Marmont have kept his divisional commanders on a tighter leash? Is this Thomier getting a little bit too overexcited and overextending and overplaying his hand? What's your read of why this ends up becoming an issue?
I mean, it's guesswork to a certain extent, but my belief now is that Marmont felt that all he had to do was appear to threaten Wellington's flank, and Wellington would retire, because it happened loads of times before. And I suspect...
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
I'm Sandra, and I'm just the professional your small business was looking for. But you didn't hire me because you didn't use LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn has professionals you can't find anywhere else, including those who aren't actively looking for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role, like me.
In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you'll miss out on great candidates like Sandra. Start hiring professionals like a professional. Post your free job on linkedin.com/spoken today.
That sense of, I don't know whether you call it complacency or not, has infected Thomier's, and he just thinks that obviously if all I'm doing is demonstrating that we'll go that way, the further I go, the better it is. And the interesting thing is, as Marmont himself said in his memoirs, McCune actually said we should be attacking Wellington, pinning him in position, and then attack his flank. And Marmont didn't want to do that. because this is easier to get Wellington to move. Is easier. It worked so far. So I suspect that, and as I say, if it was an offensive move, you'd have Tommies on the other side of the hill, so he couldn't be seen.
Absolutely. We alluded to this earlier. There is a little bit of friction, shall we say, between McCune and Marmont. You've talked a couple of times now about how Marmont almost dismisses this idea of, look, let's pin Wellington, let's kind of let's go for it. That idea gets dismissed out of hand. And so there are two things that immediately come to mind in terms of questions. One is, why is the relationship fractious? And the second is, has Marmont kind of, I don't want to say sort of lulled himself into a false sense of security, but is he sort of in the wrong mindset by this point, in the sense that he's not willing to take the fight to Wellington, perhaps for reasons related to what's happened to the French army when they have attacked Wellington on ground of his own choosing. And as a result of that, he's missing opportunities.
I mean, it's difficult to say. I think one of the things I would urge people to be cautious of is putting too much weight on what Marmont said in his memoirs, because he said different things at the time. So his anger at Marcoun is a later invention, because he felt he obviously needed somebody to blame, and Thomiez is dead, so that was no good blaming him. And what you'll see later on is he learned when it became obvious that this was a big deal, this defeat was a big deal, that he changed his story about McCune, as I'll show very, very clearly in a minute. But I suspect he was naturally expecting Wellington to retire as soon as he showed he was going to outflank him. He just botched the outflanking manoeuvre and didn't get the divisions moving together. Because one of the things that, again, you don't see much about is what is the normal deployment of the French divisions? Were they lining up for this? And they work from the lowest number division on the right. So it's very simple, whereas the British system is more complicated. With the French, it's simple. The senior division goes on the right, which is why Foy was over on the other flank, and the junior division is on the left. And so what it should have been is Thomiez, Brenier's corps, which is led by Taupin, and then McCune. So what this is showing is the order of battle under less mature than it should be. And arguably, Thomiez should not have marched off that far without Brenier next to him, or Taupin's division next to him, 6th Division. The other thing, if I can just go on, is the other thing that's interesting about McCune's division at Salamanca is a lot of their losses were actually focused on the 1st Brigade, Darnau's brigade, which would have been in the front line. And this is important for two reasons. One is actually the 2nd Brigade, this is even after the end of the battle, the 2nd Brigade still, Montfort's brigade, is still okay. While the losses of Darnaud's 1st Brigade are like, each of the regiments lost a third of the losses of the division. So 2/3 of the losses of the division are in that 1st Brigade, and only 1/3 in Montfort's brigade. And this has important implications when you come to interpret what Marmont said about McCune. So Marmont said that McCune extended himself. Well, That's not what this shows. What this shows is that McCune deployed his division, as he should have done, as is required, which is the 1st Brigade's in the front line and the 2nd Brigade's behind them as their support. And there are other elements that show that. So all of this sort of added up to this does not compute. Let's have a look in more detail at what was going on.
I'm just going to run through these numbers for the sake of those who are listening to this by the audio, the radio show, as it were. So what we've got here are casualties from McCune's 5th Division. And if you break it down by units, so effectively the front line, the 1st Brigade, as Leith hits them, would have been the 15th Lean and the 66th Lean. In terms of casualties for the 15th Lean, 17 officers, 590 men. That gives you a total of 607. For the 66th Lean, 10 officers and 578 men. That gives you a grand total of 588, as I'm sure you can work out, because I'm sure you can add 10 to most numbers in your life. The 2nd Brigade, however, is Montfort. So that's the 82nd Lean and the 86th Lean. And their casualty stats are much lower, which is the point that Gary's just been making. So 10 officers lost in the 82nd and 262 men. So grand total 272. And then the 86th Lean, 5 officers and 265 men, total 270. So you can really see the discrepancy there. The 2nd Brigade is losing, frankly, fewer men than a single regiment in the 1st Brigade. So there's a massive disparity, which is a really good point. You know, it suggests that, yes, the 1st Brigade took an absolute hammering, but the 2nd Brigade not so. And if they haven't been routed, which is what these figures would suggest, this is not, obviously the losses aren't insignificant, but they're not consistent with everybody's running away and the British heavy cavalry are sabering them as they run. Then it's a really good point that it doesn't add up, literally, in the case of figures.
Particularly when you look at it in the view of Marmont's later accusation that McCune extended himself, which would imply he put the 2 brigades side by side and filled the gap. And of course, the Sir Extend It, which Marmont actually wrote, has been interpreted in lots of ways, one of which is McCune marching down the Monte d'Azan, which it's not really good translation of the French part from anything else.
No, you're dead right. And as I alluded to earlier, actually, you go stand on the Monte d'Azan and you look at where he is and you go, no, he hasn't. It's absolutely not the case. So, okay, we've got lots of points here, but you've also flashed something else up on the screen. Talk me through this.
Well, I mean, this is the summary point, which is the McCune saved all 4 of his Eagles, all of his divisional guns. And this is not consistent with the accounts of him running away back to Albert Tormes. And a particular interest here about the guns is his chief of staff's account, Girard. Essentially, I mean, in the best book on Salamanca, Professor Muir's book, he gives Girard's account, but actually doesn't give it a huge amount of credence. But it depends what context you see it in. Now, Girard is a Frenchman writing his views, and some people get upset because at Villamuriel, where he was injured in the shoulder, he recites the conversation he had with McCune on that occasion, and people are saying, well, he couldn't have possibly remembered that. Well, as he'd had his shoulder hit, I suspect he might have done. And he's excitable and all of this, and true enough, at the beginning of his account on Salamanca, he claims that he predicted the disaster, which is never a good starting point for a authoritative account. However, what he goes on to say is that he took particular attention of the divisional guns. He formed the divisional guns into a square with the caissons, just like you see in the cowboy and Indian films. And he defended the guns against the onrushing British cavalry. Now, when you read it per se, without actually looking at the context, it sounds fanciful. This guy's just blowing his own trumpet. But the fact of the matter is, McCune's was the only division who got away with all their artillery. And so I think his account, which, I mean, dare I say it, us Anglo-Saxons tend to look at the French excitable natures as something to be less credible. I actually needs to be looked at again, I think, and because it has big impacts later on in the day, because he claims that at Alba de Tormes, when night had fallen, McCune is on the bridge, and no other senior officers around. He and McCune are on the bridge, gathering the last 1,000 men to hold the bridge against the Allied pursuit. Now, again, the key thing to remember is how late that is. When Oman has McCune's division being beaten, it's about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Darkness at that time of day then is 11 o'clock at night. So it's 6 hours later, and the whole timeline also needs thinking about when you're thinking about some of these things. Everybody talks about the Ferry's rearguard, for instance, taking place as darkness fell. You don't see many people say, well, when was that then? Well, actually, it was 10, 11 o'clock at night. So what was happening in the 5 hours before? And that 5 hours was enough time for McCune to rally his division and use it later on in the day.
That is a really good point, and I've been very guilty of that. I've never thought about exactly the timings. I think in my head I'd kind of assumed it must have been somewhere between about 9 and 10. That last stand, and you know, you looked into it. I haven't looked at the time of nightfall there in that part of the world on that particular date. That's a really interesting point.
You have to, if you believe the conventional stories, by 7:30 at night, McCune's division would have been across the bridge at Alba de Tormes and gone. Yet there he is, last thing at night, 11 o'clock at night, standing on the bridge. And you can say Girard is making it up. Well, why would he? He didn't think McCune was a Marshal Ney. He didn't think he was a great man, but he's placed him there. And but that's a long way ahead of where we need to start, which is, so what did Marmont actually want McCune to do?
Okay, well, yeah, let's start there.
So if you go back to Oman's map again, and what I've highlighted here is the village, Rapelais village, the position to the. I've said to the southwest. It's actually west-southwest of the village, where McCune is supposed to be, and I've highlighted the Greater Arapel. There's a piece of land in between which Oman's got nobody in, and you have to ask yourself what goes on there. And this shows the modern topography of Oman's map, if you like. So I've placed McCune's and Leith's divisions on it, little boxes, the actual sizes that they would have, deployment sizes that the battalions would have occupied. And as I said earlier on, if Leith attacked south, you'd have expected the 5th Division of the Army of Portugal to retreat south. One of the things I want you to notice is between McCune's supposed position and the Greater Arapel, there are actually a series of low-level ridge lines that run down to the village. And on the extreme end of one is the position that the 122nd Linear occupied. And I think when you look at what Marmont said, and I'll read this out, on the 25th of July, Marmont wrote to the King of Spain. And this is his first statement of what went on. I caused it, the tableland, to be occupied by the 5th Division and the reserve of horse artillery, with strict orders to confine themselves to the taking of the tableland. McCune broke and drove off the English detachment who occupied the heights. I thought it necessary to bring up fresh troops to act with vigour in support of General McCune. And I've underlined this so that General McCune, notwithstanding the brilliant success which he had obtained, was forced by superior numbers to retire. So this is what he said about McCune straight after the battle. And that, of course, does not match what anybody thinks McCune did on that day. And it certainly doesn't match what Marmont later wrote.
I'm still, sorry, if we can just go back to that, I'm still fixated on General McCune broke and drove off the English detachment which occupied the heights.
Yeah.
Well, that doesn't get featured in any story. What's he referring to, though?
Good question. Good question. Good question. It's I mean, there was the race for the Greater Arapel, but the French got there first.
Exactly. So they had occupied those.
I think what he's talking about is the piece of land that I highlighted the map, which is not the Monte d'Azan. It's the piece of land immediately adjacent to it.
You have to question also, well, that doesn't work either, because you've got the British 4th Division attack, which obviously gets broken. Doesn't get broken by McCune's men, but that's not the point. You know, to what extent has something got conflated in Marmont's mind? The guy has just been injured. You know, you have to kind of consider every eventuality, but that's not consistent either, because the British hadn't occupied any heights for that to be the case. So that's a bit baffling, all things considered.
Well, the particularly baffling thing is that General McCune, notwithstanding the brilliant success which he had obtained, so Marmont left that battle not thinking that McCune had done anything wrong.
No. If anything, McCune's the hero of the hour.
On that occasion, yeah.
Okey-doke.
And by the 6 days later, Marmont wrote to the Minister of War, and the position has started to shift slightly. I gave orders to the 5th Division to take position on the extreme right of this plateau, the fire from which was perfectly connected with that from Arapelais. The 5th Division, after taking the indicated post, extended to the left without any motive nor reason. And here you start to get the extended. Well, again, so extend it is not move. It means deploy. And deploy the 2 brigades or deploy skirmishers. And so we started to move. And then the other thing we have about McCune is Napier in 1836 says that McCune maintained a noble battle during the withdrawal, which is interesting for a couple of reasons. Now, he clearly, from the account, gets confused with Bonnet and Ferry's divisions at different times, perhaps. But the thing that's interesting about this is that this is at the same time as some of the French accounts of the battle were being published. And around that time, they were all blaming Thomieres. McCune never got a mention as being the author of the defeat at Salamanca. And so, you know, at around 1830, nobody's dressing McCune up as the idiot. But I want to come back to this point that Marmont made. I gave orders to the 5th Division to take a position on the extreme right of the plateau. And remember that for later. And this is what is in the memoirs, which is a lot of text, so I won't read it all out. And McCune made this point that I referred to earlier, that they should be attacking the British, and Marmon's then telling him he's got to keep calm. McCune, a man of little capacity, though a very brave soldier, could not contain himself when he's in the presence of the enemy. And he then talks about an incident on the Passage of Douro some days before, which he claimed compromised the army. It didn't. It didn't even get mentioned in Oman. All that McCune did is he went half a mile further down the road than he should have done. But there was no threat. The British had left a long time before. So you can see here, having had little regard for his obedience, I determined to go there myself. And having taken a last look at the top of the road, you get the story of him being wounded by the cannon fire. So he's making the point that he needed, by this time, so this is 1850s, that he felt he needed to go and keep control of McCune.
And there's always been one significant thing that I've never entirely bought about this, which is, I need to ride off and deal with this myself. Does he, though? Because he's, for me, this is something that you can say. He's got aides. He can send a rider off and say, I need you to do this instead. He doesn't necessarily need to be on the ground at this point. So I've always kind of regarded this, I was about to mount my horse and ride off and save the entire day thing as something that you can talk about with the benefit of hindsight, because he knows that after that point, everything really goes badly wrong. So I've always considered that as saving face, but others, of course, disagree. But what's your read of it?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that he doesn't say here, I was getting on my horse, go and ride after Tomies. And because that's where he should have gone.
Mm-hmm.
And they probably did send an aide. I don't know. The point is, if it's right that McCune was on the end of the plateau, and was advancing towards the Araples village, then that's only a short ride down. I mean, it's right next door. French leaders were, Wellington had a lot in common with them in some regards. He tends to be compared to Napoleon, but most French leaders would have got on their horse and rode to the 150 yards, 200 yards down to say, hang on, you need to be doing this. The French leaders, by and large, are lead from the front type of guys. So I don't disbelieve that. Mm-hmm. The question I would ask is, why don't you go and chase after Tomies an hour before?
That is
and the answer is because Tomies was doing what he wanted him to do.
Yeah, it's a really good and really interesting point. Gary, we've already covered a whole host of head-scratching, that was alliterative, I wasn't anticipating that, but a whole host of head-scratching points. I can't find an H on which to end that sentence. Thank you for sharing all of this with us. Obviously, we're not done yet, but we are out of time for what will become episode 1 of this on the podcast. Folks, if you want the whole thing, well, you're going to need to head over to YouTube if you want to listen to it right here, right now. The rest of it will be released in a few days' time, so you can look forward to hearing that if you want to listen to the audio version, or the whole video file is available right now on the Napoleonic Wars channel. Gary, massive thanks for this. It's been an absolutely fascinating start, and I'm really looking forward to us continuing the conversation very shortly. Folks, if you're new here, remember to hit the subscribe button so that you can find your way back. Much love to all my Patreon supporters, and shout outs to my Mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Coulson, Jim Getz, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Rob Coughlin, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Andrew Wright, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, Ulrich Decado,
James Fluick, Roger O'Donnell, Natasha Hobday, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, David Malinsky, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Adam Green, Tim Day, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Armin Darwin, Carol Dixon-Smith, Paul Gasek, and Roland Shark. And the Admirals, John Haynes, JC Kaiser, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Laird Campbell, Graham Swidenbank, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Steve Carter, and Clemens. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.
Folks, a quick reminder of what I said at the start. If you want to enjoy 20% off Glory is Fleeting, the book in which you'll find Gary Wills's chapter that we've talked about in this episode, please go to hellion.co.uk, select Glory is Fleeting, and then on checkout, type in the following discount code, GLORY23, that's GLORY 23, and you will enjoy 20% off Glory is Fleeting. Big thanks to Hellion for arranging that discount code, and I hope you enjoy reading a little bit more about Gary's work. Bear in mind that part 2 is incoming very soon.
Hey, it's Danny Pellegrino from Everything Iconic. Ready to upgrade your style game without blowing your budget? Check out Quince. They've got all the good stuff, shirts and polos, activewear, and fine leather goods, all at 50 to 80% less than other high-end brands. And the best part? They're all about safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing. Get that luxury vibe without the luxury price tag. Hit up quince.com/upgrade for free shipping and 365-day returns on your next order. That's quince.com/upgrade.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
Winning is an everyday mindset, and we're here to help. I'm Craig Robinson. Join me and Coach John Calipari for Ways to Win. We're kicking off during March Madness. Cal's Kentucky Wildcats are in the hunt. So throughout the tournament, I'm going to call up my friend to ask about his wins, losses, and especially what he's telling his players in the locker room.
You got to win every day.
Find the Ways to Win podcast anywhere you listen.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.